All right, guys, I'm going to break down for you right now why I have no doubt that MAGA is going to fail. And when I say that, what I mean is the public of the United States of America will revolt. There will be backlash. There will come an instance where Trump's approval rating dips to 35% or even lower. We might get to as low as what it was on January 7th, right after the riot. So I'm very certain of this for a number of reasons. Number one, we saw what that first term was like. We saw he wasn't popular throughout that first term. We saw moments where he really bottomed out kind of low. I believe 31% may have been his lowest number. We know what his agenda is. His agenda is George W. Bush's fourth term, cut taxes for the rich, deregulate, stuff his administration with Wall Street executives and billionaires, and mix that this time around with even more rank, overt authoritarianism. That is a toxic mix. That is not something people are looking forward to. The reason Trump won is because he has the vibe of a revolutionary. People think he's going to bring change. The problem is he's a revolutionary conservative, and people are not going to like the conservative part of that revolution. So, why is this all going to fall apart? Because of the following. I'm about to show you a video. Now, granted, this video came out about over a decade ago. This video came out. So understand that the situation is probably even worse today. But what this video explains is the meat of the problem as to why our country is in such dire straits, as to why everybody's so pissed off, everybody's so angry. Every election is a swing election where you kick the bums out and you want something new, you want something different. What you're about to see here is the meat of the problem with our political system. And the fact of the matter is we know Trump is going to do nothing to fix this. In fact, he's going to make it work. And the population will not stand for it. So MAGA will implode on itself. The question is, how bad is it going to get before we get to that point, right? And the other question is, how much of the agenda did they get through? How much do the Democrats lay down on a chalk outline of themselves? How much do the other Republicans cuck themselves to Trump? How much does the media fight back effectively? These are all yet to be seen. But what I know for sure is what will happen is more hawkishness when it comes to foreign policy, more tax cuts for the rich, more deregulation. It'll be conservatism on steroids and human growth hormone. And then we can only hope that the incompetence of Trump and everybody around him makes it so they can't fully follow through with the authoritarianism, which is part of the agenda as well, right? But they're probably going to do some semblance of mass deportations. It can get pretty ugly. But eventually, America will turn on MAGA. Why? Because this is what we're dealing with at the moment, both under previous administrations and under what will be the next Trump administration. This is income and wealth inequality in the U.S. and how insanely out of whack it has gotten. As you're watching this, ask yourself, did you really think that it was this bad? Here we go.
A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly.
So in other words, for people just listening to this podcast style, the American people thought there's a decent amount of income and wealth inequality. Here's what we think it looks like in chart form, right? And then they say, well, what's ideal? And they limited that wealth and income inequality and said, this would be more ideal. There's still a curve, right? There's still, a group that is, working class, and then there's a middle class, and then there's a wealthy group, but the chart is pretty reasonable, let's say. The Gini coefficient, as it's called, is kind of reasonable. Okay, watch this.
But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing.
That's an insane fact. That's an insane fact.
I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth.
1% of Americans have 40% of the nation's wealth. Look at this chart. Look at this chart. This is the reality. Now wait, he's going to give you another fact, which is mind-blowing.
The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this is...
The bottom 80% of the country only has 7% of the nation's wealth. That is what we like to call unsustainable. That is what we like to call a pubic hair's length away from fucking pitchfork time.
Only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%.
The top 1% used to make 9% of the nation's income. Now the top 1% makes 24% of the nation's income.
Meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
I can't get over that fact that the bottom 80% of the country has just 7% of the wealth. So why do I know MAGA is going to fail? Because not only is Trump not going to address this, he's going to make it worse. he's going to make it worse. It was under Trump and his tax bill that for the first time in our history, billionaires paid a lower effective tax rate than working class people. Isn't that astonishing? They paid a lower effective tax rate. As a percentage, billionaires paid less than working class people. Trump's new tax plan, we just covered an analysis on it the other day. It's going to raise taxes on working class people and cut taxes for the wealthy. Again, let me reiterate, this is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. A country can't continue like this. This is, bodies in the streets very soon. So he's going to do nothing to fix this. In fact, remember, during his first term, he packed his administration with more Wall Street executives and billionaires than any other administration in history. He's doing the same thing now. And like I said, fourth term of George W. Bush. So this is going to implode in on itself. But we need to address this reality. Now, by the way, how did it get so out of whack? That's the question that I know most of you are probably thinking. The answer is actually very straightforward. From the mid-1970s and onward, there were a number of Supreme Court decisions which effectively legalized bribery in our country. It made it so that money is viewed as free speech. And so therefore, a super PAC or a corporate PAC, they can spend unlimited amounts of money to get politicians in there. We have very few rules, even when it comes to directly contributing to campaigns. There's very few rules. There's all these loopholes. So effectively what happened is billionaires and multinational corporations bought our politicians. The politicians started representing just the billionaires and the multinational corporations, and working people got totally ignored. They got shoved to the side. Our government doesn't represent us anymore. If they did, we already would have, say, universal background checks. We already would have higher minimum wage. We already would have universal health care. We already have higher taxes on the rich. There's no correlation between what the public actually wants according to the polling and what the government does. Because of that, the corruption at the heart of the system. That's what led to this. Trump is not only going to not fix that, again, he's exacerbated the problem and made it worse. He had a meeting at Mar-a-Lago with his billionaires and flat out told them in a quid pro quo way, hey, you give me more money, I'll give you more tax cuts, I'll give you more subsidies. He took $100 million from Miriam Adelson in return for allowing Israel to totally annex the West Bank. It's only going to get worse. He's not going to raise the minimum wage. He's not going to give us the PRO Act, which would give more working people a union, which would increase pay and increase benefits. He's not going to do universal health care, which would massively help. Number one cause of bankruptcy in this country is medical bills. It would help massively. He's not going to do that. None of the things that are on the agenda, none of the things that are on the table are going to fix the country and are going to materially improve people's lives. So look, the door is wide open, man. The door is wide open for, instead of the fake populist on the right, Donald Trump, to win, a real populist on the left can win. We got to get the money out of the political system, which is easier said than done, but we should have clean elections. We should have public financing of elections. We should make it so billionaires and corporations don't have the control in this way that they do have. But beyond that, you just have to stand for an agenda for the people and fight for it relentlessly. And that's how you win. I talk about this all the time now, but it would be great if a Democrat ran on, you know what? We're going to make this country number one in the world. The infrastructure is going to be number one in the world. That's my goal. I don't just want to do an infrastructure bill that updates things. I want to have the number one infrastructure in the world. We're going to spend whatever we have to spend in order to get to that point. We're going to tax the wealthy to afford it. We're going to end the corruption and have clean elections. We're going to switch to a 4-day work week because Americans are overworked and underpaid. We're going to do a higher minimum wage. We're going to do universal health care. We're going to do Social Security for all. Universal basic income system. We've seen countless studies now on universal basic income, and the gist of it is that money almost always gets spent on important, necessary things, everyday basics. It doesn't get wasted on lotto tickets or alcohol or drugs. It goes to the fucking light bill. It goes for food, right? It gives people a little bit of wiggle room. They can pay the bills. They can survive. Some people were able to take that and leave a job that they hated and go get a new job because they finally had a tiny bit of a cushion. Guys, remember, $50 trillion was stolen from the bottom 90% of the country. This is not me speaking. There was a Rand Corporation study that said, I believe from the 1970s until today, $50 trillion was stolen from the bottom 90% and given to the top 1%. They say if we just kept the wealth disparity the same as it was back then, every American would have an extra $1,100 every month for the rest of their life. That's how much the system is rigged. This is the result of corporations and billionaires buying the government and rigging it in their favor and against you. This is the result. We have to unrig it. The first president to actually fight back against this oligarchy and this kleptocracy and this corruption will go down in history as one of the greatest ever. Just like FDR had to do with the New Deal, you'll have just the greatest president of all time who can effectively unrig the system and get us out of this. It's not going to be Trump. Trump is going to double down on the corruption. He's going to make it worse. He's going to help his rich buddies out and his corporate buddies out as he does more war. And that's why ultimately MAGA is going to fail. And I don't think it'll even be particularly close. I think very quickly the public is going to sour on Trump because these numbers, this income and wealth inequality, this insane distribution of resources is only going to get worse. And that anger is only going to increase. And there's going to be a backlash. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.